Just one sort of question. There's a whole slew of issues that one could discuss, I guess, here. But one little question. So this reading of Pyrrho that Hegel gives, and that I think you're seeing Schelling as more or less agreeing with, at least generically, has this key feature for your talk anyway of seeing Pyrrho as embracing a kind of freedom, and this freedom of character, or developing a kind of freedom. And I guess my question about that, or a question about that, is isn't that really just projecting something onto Pyrrho that's not there? I mean, all the emphasis in Pyrrhonism is quite the opposite. It's on necessitation. It's on not undertaking Stoic assent, willed assent. It's on receiving laws and so on from the community. It's not at all a matter of freedom. The word freedom is not one of their ideals, right. And nor is the thought. It's quite on the contrary. If anything, it's the opposite. So.
Right, thank you. So, so I do, right, as I kind of make the transition to those remarks about freedom and necessity, note that Hegel goes beyond anything that we can quite find or can really find at all in the sources, in the source texts. So I don't think that his use of the word freedom is in any way sort of, as it were, exegetically motivated. However, one of the things about Pyrrho that I think is really striking in some of these kind of, anecdotal things, the things that often seem to be adduced to make him seem ridiculous, right? Yeah, he falls into a lake and almost drowns, so his friend pulls him out of it. But he's so unconventional that he doesn't even say thank you. He just kind of walks on, right? You think, oh, what a chump! This is absurd. Right? But the thing that's kind of shocking about that is that he's acting in a way that completely departs from any kind of conventional codex of how you ought to be. Now, contrast that, for example, with the conflict that we have with Antigone and Creon, for example. I mean, their whole difficulty and what makes them, as it were, objects for customs and laws, is that they can't in any way step outside the social roles that define their personalities. They're completely locked into that. Right? There's no space outside of that. And I think the liberating aspect that Hegel sees in Pyrrhonism is that you do sort of say, well, it's all custom, right? There's nothing that really determines how I ought to be other than whatever is a kind of, internal, feeling that moves me in one direction or the other. That's all there is. And that is a kind of, of course that goes dangerously from the Hegelian perspective in the direction of Schlegelian irony. And then, Hegel for the rest of his life is more or less sort of concerned to put a lid on that because he thinks that's a terrible thing. But Schlegelian irony, or its kind of, early Pyrrhonist counterpart, is, I think, an essential kind of aspect of the experience of freedom. So I think that Hegel is latching on to something important there.
So it may be that this distinction you're drawing between Pyrrho and the later development of Pyrrho in Sextus, for example, becomes very important in this respect too.
Sextus is reactionary.
So these aspects of unfreedom that Sextus is making a lot of, that I mentioned, are really more him than Pyrrho on your reading. I mean, there's one other feature of things that I guess may lend a bit of plausibility to your story. In the phenomenology, or to this story about Pyrrhonism, in the phenomenology, of course, there's a chapter on skepticism,
right,
short section, and there the generic picture seems to be that you get sort of oppressions, the Herrschaft and Knechtschaft, and then you have skepticism. It sounds like ancient skepticism, Pyrrhonism, as a sort of withdrawal or an attempt to escape from that. And following Stoicism tries it first, and then skepticism continues it, and then Christian unhappy consciousness is a further development. So,
Right.
so that would be one way of reading it. It's in part the intuition that, rather as you were saying about Pyrrho, you're kind of withdrawing from society, which is oppressive.
Right. Well, just one thing about the phenomenology, that part of it. So, on the one hand, there's a clear continuity between that and the early skepticism essay, insofar as Hegel there continues to thematize skepticism in the context of the freedom of self-consciousness. There's no doubt. But I think in the early essay, he does not focus so much on the polemical, other-directed relation of the Pyrrhonist. Whereas when you get to the phenomenology, that's really at the center of it, right? What the Pyrrhonist is constantly doing is seeking out people, others that he can disagree with for the pleasure of disagreeing, be it even at the cost of contradicting himself, right? That's the famous, he's childish in that way. That's the way Hegel portrays the Pyrrhonist in the phenomenology. That, I think, is, if you will, I'm not trying to valorize it with this term, but I think that's an aspect of his mature aspect towards Pyrrhonism, and it's one that's informed by his allergy against Schlegelian irony and the kind of perceived socially disintegrating effects that it's going to have. And I think he's really worried about that in ways that he's not worried about in the 1802 essay, or not as clearly, it's not as clearly in evidence there. So I guess the aspects of a kind of withdrawal are really primary for me in the earlier one, and he doesn't really seem to see I guess it's a good thing to withdraw if you're living in a society like the one of Antigone and Creon. But it's not a good thing to do that if you're living, I guess, in the rational state where freedom has been realized. I guess that would be the kind of mature view. If we want to share that, that's kind of the question.
Thanks.
Thanks for your talk. I just wondered if you could maybe clarify a bit more what you see as maybe the differences between Hegel and Schelling. So, I take the point, and this is helpful, that sort of the part of the post-Kantian perspective on intellectual freedom is that freedom is not, the freedom to know the ends necessary, and it's not a theoretical freedom, but a practical freedom. It's the freedom to rather than the freedom to know, we might say it's the freedom to live, or the freedom to, take on a certain character. And we can see, the problem of nihilism and Jacobi being sort of in the background to push this shift in what you call the post-Kantian perspective. Mm-hmm. And you see this pretty clearly in the Philosophical Letters in Schelling, where he says that, a system has indelibly stamped on it, the face of the person or the individual. Right. And he says explicitly later on that, no system has anything more than subjective validity and subjective value. So you can see a sort of, the sort of existentialist or practical thrust there. And so I was just wondering how to either compare or contrast that with what you have quoted from Hegel in number 9. And so I would just ask you what you thought of that, because here in 9, Hegel is saying that the skeptic, I'll just read it. In recognizing that there is nothing to this natural necessity, the skeptic is elevated above it by the freedom of reason. At the same time, he pays highest honor to it, just as he does not hold any of its particulars to be something certain, but only necessity itself and its universality, nor does he himself introduce any particularity. You can see the self-abnegating or self-effacing move there. Into it, as an absolute purpose, he would seek to accomplish in the sphere of necessity, as though he knew what is good. And so there seems to be a kind of resistance to the idea that the subject could somehow be the criterion of what's good. I'm curious about what the role of character is playing here in this post-Kantian perspective. Yeah, right. No, it's a very good question because it's sort of touches on the neuralgic point, and really, I mean, to be kind of honest, I think it's the same neuralgic point that Michael was kind of putting his finger on, at least in my perception of it. I mean, I'm troubled by aspects of Hegel's thought that tend to suppress
a certain kind of individuality and autonomy. And I mean, I know that I'm going to be, this is somewhat contradictory to what I was just saying, actually, and that's why it feels like a neuralgic point to me. But for Hegel, this kind of, as it were, negation of the individual self and this kind of reconformation or reconfiguration of the self in the image of the universal, either in the sense of Bildung that he associates with the economic sphere, right, of a kind of economic necessity that pushes the individual to a certain kind of conformity, which he thinks is a good thing, and also in his kind of political theology, the way he reads the crucifixion as a kind of complete denigration of the individual, in order to have it kind of reborn in the spirit of the community, right? But it's not something separate from the community. I think those are strongly conformist aspects of Hegel's ethical and political thought that are not as pronounced, and perhaps aren't even really present in Schelling's early thought. And so I feel kind of ambivalent about this because I can see aspects of this kind of rational freedom that he talks about with what I'm calling Ur-Pyrrhonism as pointing in a kind of direction that's similar to Schelling, but he really does not at all emphasize the aspect with which that kind of depersonalization is a theoretical ideal which by following leads to a kind of flowering of individuality and empowerment subjectively of myself. And I see that missing in Hegel in a systematic and troublingly systematic way.
Just that's helpful, thank you. And just to follow up, I mean, one place you might look is elsewhere in the letters where Schelling praises Spinoza for his sort of willingness to identify himself with substance, with the all, in a kind of self-abnegating move, which he nonetheless reads as a practical move. I mean, this was,
right.
He calls it Spinoza's character that allows him to do that, and so this may be a precedent.
Right, but which is not like a giving up of the self, but actually an expansion of the self. And I had both his quotations in the longer version of the paper, and also the one that you just cited at the beginning. Yeah, indeed.
Okay, great, you're miles ahead of me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a very different reading of what's going on in Schelling and skepticism. I have a very long story about this, but just for the background, I think that what he's up to, and I also think that what Hegel's up to, is a theory of theory building. So Schelling thinks that there are certain conditions for what it is to build a theory. And they, for instance, a theory is an object of freedom, not an object of knowledge. And that's from 14, right? Remarkably, that's from the letters. I didn't have this. 14 is also from the letter, right?
They're all from the letters.
Yeah, okay. Because, the title of the freedom essay is über das Wesen der Menschenfreiheit und die damit zusammenhängenden Gegenstände. So, the objects of freedom. So, this is a topic that continues. And I think Schelling, what Schelling argues, and where he thinks that he disagrees or might disagree with Hegel on some level, is that, developing a theory is an action. So, there are specific conditions for developing a theory that are tied to our conception as agents. And I think all of this really is part of a theory of action and the objects of freedom. An object of freedom, I would translate what Schelling calls an object of freedom in action. Like if I go and buy some beer, then the object of freedom is the action carried out by buying a beer. And I think that Schelling applies, this kind of thought about what it is for something to be an action to theory building. He thinks that it's a condition on philosophical theory building that you conceive yourself as an agent in just that very sense of agency. And he seems to be emphasizing that. And Schelling thinks that the skeptic is helpful in order to shed the right light on that activity, precisely because the skeptic tells us something about how theory building works, namely, it's aesthetic, there are conditions on inquiry, etc., etc. So whereas Schelling thinks, and I think Schelling's wrong about this, but whereas Schelling thinks that Hegel thinks of the activity of building a philosophical theory in the way that most of us would think of that activity, namely, write down true propositions that hang together in the right inferential way and are justified, etc., etc. And Schelling thinks that if you think that this is all that philosophy is doing, then you're missing the agency aspect. I think this is where the action takes place.
Yeah,
but I think that Schelling's wrong about Hegel there on this level. Hegel has the same idea. It's the idea of the good in the science of logic, etc. So there's, I think this objection utterly misses the object. But that is all. There's some.
I'm still looking for the disagreement between us, though, because I think that's exactly. I think that's exactly right. And so, I mean, my way of saying that would be that. And again, I'm influenced by Spinoza in a certain way in my view of this, and I'm especially interested by a couple of essays by Stuart Hampshire on Spinoza and individualism in this, and a certain view of what adequate knowledge consists in. But so with that, just as a kind of gesture towards a source, this is what I'd say. Look, when we are being scientifically creative, as I put it in one way, and that's supposed to emphasize the agency aspect, we can tell that we're on to it, because our theories, our propositions hang together in that characteristic way that is valorized in the demonstrative ideal of knowledge. There's something empowering about that. But we shouldn't think that that theory, as this activity that has value, takes its value from the truth or from the inferential relations that we're tracing. Those inferential relations that we're tracing are, as it were, the reflection of precisely the free self-constituting agency that we are in that moment. Right? That's what intellectual intuition is about for Spinoza, and I think that goes through. And the reference to the good in Hegel is very apropos.
On that level, I think we're on an agreement, a perfect agreement. But there's maybe it's just a different way. Like there might be a difference in the way of putting it. Recall the discussion with Rachel yesterday when she said that she was trying to look for a way of reading Sextus's skepticism that does not make it dependent on a personality. So on some readings, when you say existential or individual or personal, in particular when it comes to Schelling already, but also to Hegel, on some reading it looks as if, there are these, like there's this character, Spinoza, and he's this kind of character, and there's this other character. And I think Schelling wants to say that theories have a specific character. So,
right. Well, it's like Newton. Newton submits the famous anonymous solution, and everybody knows it's Newton. Why? Because the lion is recognized by his paw. Right? It's not because it's some particularity, some idiosyncrasy of Newton. It's the very style of creating a context of necessity that shows this must be Newton and not Barrow or whoever.
Thanks.
Thank you. So, if I understand you, you're saying that for Schelling, practical certainty is unique in that it doesn't have a fixed representational content. So, would it be fair to say that practical certainty has sort of a unique intentional structure in that it's reflexive? It's my sort of self-consciousness of expanding or developing my cognitive powers. Is that a sort of a fair assessment?
Yeah. So,
and this is what you want to tie to Schelling's kind of perfectionism that you're linking to Spinoza.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, I guess I just have a suggestion that maybe another contrast, if you want to relate this notion of practical certainties to something like joy in Spinoza's system, I wonder if a helpful contrast would be to the notion of intellectual pleasure in Descartes. And that would be another way of getting at this this contrast that you're trying to establish between Cartesian certainty and practical certainty. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I do. So really, the reason and the place where this thing that Descartes says that I quoted, where that first became salient to me, was, well, in a double context. First is that before the cogito is ever enunciated, right, what he becomes aware of is his ability to resist being duped by the, evil genius. That's the first thing. So it's a kind of practical Selbstvergewisserung, as you could say. Right? But then in this later passage, I was thinking, well, you know, how is freedom different for Spinoza and Descartes? And I was just, there's a place as different as they are where they touch. And it's in this idea that the highest grade of freedom I have is when I'm acting with no consciousness of alternatives, right? Or if they're there as mere possibilities that are completely without attraction for me, right? People, I just saw that movie, that Edward Snowden movie where he says, yeah, there's something about this situation. All I do is act and react. I have no choices to make. Now I'm in it, right? And there's something liberating about that, he says. And I think that there's a kind of, you know, experiential basis there that is theorized in a certain way in that Descartes quote and in the Spinoza quote. But then maybe I went off on a tangent. Was that a response?
Yeah, no, that helps. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to go back to Hegel for a moment. When one reads the passages from this early text, Hegel seems to acknowledge a connection between a skeptical spirit and freedom. But the Schelling passages you quoted suggest that you get, in a certain sense, dogmatic and loose freedom if you undertake the enterprise of a systematical philosophy. Now, when one looks at the mature writings of Hegel, especially in the doctrine of the concept in the science of logic, freedom is very closely tied to the concept, which is nothing else but the system of the categories. So the suggestion seems to be that Hegel somehow lost freedom on his way in constructing the system of philosophy, the system of the categories. Now, is it just that? Is it just a story of losing that spirit for freedom that he had in his earlier works? Or would you say that there's a more complicated story which we could tell to make it consistent with his earlier views?
Yeah, so thank you, right. Yeah, so the waters are deep here, and it makes me wish I were a better swimmer, so to speak, having, you know, ventured into the water now. So, you know, there's a sense in which, now that people who are Schellingians are going to cry out maybe at this, there's a sense in which Schelling just doesn't give us a logic the way Hegel does. I mean, I think one of the things that Hegel, that makes him really distinct in comparison, say, to Kant, to Fichte and Schelling, and indeed to Kant, is that he gives us a kind of logic. Now, the thing is, what is that logic doing? I mean, I think that it's really a kind of, you know, if you will, a kind of theory or a kind of, you know, pragmatic reenactment of self-constitution or the constitution of the categories. You could say, you know, it's a kind of account of why, when we are running into those kinds of necessary connections that make the demonstrative ideal seem very attractive to us in the broadest sense, why that's the form that our freedom is taking, our kind of cognitive, our theoretical agency, if you will, why those two things link up. So I don't want to say that in that sense, having a system is contrary to the kind of freedom that Schelling too is appealing to, because Schelling also obviously has a kind of account, even in the letters and then, you know, before that and after that, of why it is that a certain kind of dogmatism is wrong. But what we need to do here, and that's a difficult thing to do, is draw a distinction between levels of theories. Levels at which we're engaged in object-directed, kind of, you know, liberating ourselves, also technologically, you know, in the world, for example, which we're not doing philosophically, and how those need to remain open, and an account, a kind of, you know, higher level account, if you will, of why they need to remain open. And that, I think, is not a theory or a system of the same type. Because in those terms, I think both Schelling and Hegel have closed theories, yeah? Yeah.
have it's basically, I think, a question of clarification. So the idea of a cognitive state that you appeal to at the very end, so the idea of a cognitive state that is devoid of content, or the idea of an empty representation that is described as the highest act of freedom, it might raise a worry or could be read in the following way. Well, he wants to say that there are cognitive states of two sorts. The one,
who are you referring to? I just didn't hear the word.
no name. I think it's just a general worry how to read that idea of cognitive state that is devoid of content. The one reading would say that you suggest that there are two kinds of cognitive states, the one that have content and the other that don't. Two kinds of representation, the one that are empty and the ones that are not. And I think that obviously would raise the question of, in terms of what can we distinguish one representation from another, in terms of what can we individuate one representation from another, if not in terms of their content. And that would make suspicious the very idea of an empty representation, the very idea of a cognitive state devoid of content. So I think that's, probably not how to read the suggestion, but rather we would think of this cognitive state devoid of content as a cognitive state that is not devoid of that is devoid of any particular content, such that it is a cognitive state that is not a particular cognitive state, but rather, I don't know how to express it, but somehow a cognitive state that is, so to say, part of, or the condition of, or actualized in every other particular cognitive state, or any particular representation of a particular content. And if that is right, I mean, that might help me to understand how the very idea of a subjectivity with respect to which the idea of cognition that is described as a limitation to subjectivity could be understood. Because, I mean, I find that a very hard idea, to think of cognition as a limitation to subjectivity, as you described it, but then it would mean any particular cognition is a limitation to subjectivity. But that doesn't, to think of cognition as a limitation to subjectivity doesn't force us to think that there is an idea of freedom available prior to the idea of cognition, but that the idea of freedom that we need is the idea of freedom that is, so to say, not prior, but somehow that is the condition of any particular cognition. And in that respect, I mean, with respect to that idea of a cognitive freedom, any particular cognition can be described as a limitation to that. Is that, I mean, I just wonder, would that be a right way to read what you were after?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think that would be a right way. So I wrote these concluding couple of paragraphs where words like cognitive, non-cognitive crop up just as I was, about to pull into the main train station at Bonn, and I had this feeling, I'm not sure if that's exactly the way I want to put this. The reason I'm putting it that way is because it seems like, I mean, here was kind of the thought, well, there's this sense of rational necessitation. When I'm onto a good theory, things fit together in a way that might not be exactly like analytic necessity, but there are some self-ramifying or mutually ramifying relations between the parts of the theory that make me say, yeah, that must be it. That's how it has to be. It's just, the traditional idea. There's a kind of insight into necessity that is mirrored on the subjective side, as it were, with a feeling of some kind of compulsion to believe, right? What Habermas calls den zwanglosen Zwang of the better argument, right? The non-coercive coercion. Okay, so I'm trying to put that sort of experience of a kind of non-coercive coercion, right? I think we have a kind of feeling of empowerment as a good feeling, right? I mean, if you like doing geometrical proofs, it's because you think it's a cool feeling to like have certain kinds of insights. There's a kind of intellectual pleasure involved in that. And then try to sort of bring that feeling together with the idea, if you idealize those kinds of local context of necessity, of rational necessity, of logical linking, you begin to idealize that, then you come to these kind of, Spinozist, Leibnizian ideas about, well, the world, it has to be intelligible in a certain way, it all has to be laid out, it all has to be deterministic, because my feeling of cognition is guided by that kind of, feeling of non-coercive coercion. So what I'm trying to do is just kind of separate two aspects of this and say, well, there's a feeling of freedom, there's a feeling of cognitive agency involved in having that kind of insight, and then there's this kind of idealization of that on the side of the objects that I'm talking about. And so I want to say, well, it's an interesting thing that when you really kind of idealize that to the max in the idea of the principle of sufficient reason or a necessary being, you end up with ideas that are really empty. What's attractive about that? Well, it's somehow mirroring this feeling of, it's sort of saying, well, there's something unlimited about our agency in creating these kinds of contexts. But theoretically, it seems to be exactly contrary to that, right? It seems to be saying, well, everything's determined, it's all necessitated, I don't have any kind of agency at all. I don't think compatibilism is an option. I don't find that attractive. So there's a way of saying, well, no, you can have a libertarian theory here. You just have to see that what we're looking for when we talk about a kind of deterministic metaphysics is really a kind of projection of these local feelings, these local experiences, positive experiences of cognitive agency. That's kind of the direction. Non-cognitive, I don't know, because it's inseparable from that.